Imagine the greatest army history has ever seen, riding across your lands, slaughtering everything in its path. Now imagine it stopping for no apparent reason. In the early months of 1242, a strange stillness settled over Europe. The kind of silence that follows catastrophe but offers no relief. Snow lay heavy across the plains of Hungary, covering the scars left by fire and steel, and beneath that frozen ground were the remnants of towns that had ceased to exist only weeks before. Roads that once carried merchants and pilgrims now carried only rumors, whispered by survivors who fled westward with hollow eyes and broken voices. They spoke of riders who moved faster than messengers, of armies that appeared without warning, of cities erased so completely that even their names seemed to vanish with them. Across monasteries and courts, from the Baltic to the Alps, the same question hung unspoken in the air. When the Mongols returned in the spring, would anyone be left to stop them? To the people of medieval Europe, the Mongols seemed to arrive from nowhere, as if summoned by divine punishment or unleashed from the edge of the world. In truth, their story began far earlier, on a vast stretch of land most Europeans could not even place on a map. The Eurasian steppe was not a nation nor a kingdom, but a living system of grasslands, stretching thousands of miles from the plains of Hungary to the borders of China. Life there was unforgiving. Winters killed the unprepared, droughts destroyed the careless, and survival demanded constant movement. Families lived on horseback, their wealth measured in animals, not land. Children learned balance and bowmanship before they learned fear. In this world, strength alone was not enough. Discipline, cooperation, and memory were everything. From this environment emerged a man named Temujin, born into obscurity and violence, whose early life was marked by betrayal, hunger, and near constant struggle. He learned quickly that survival on the steppe depended not on noble bloodlines, but on loyalty and competence. When he rose to power, he broke with tradition, promoting men based on ability rather than ancestry and binding his followers with laws that applied to all, regardless of rank. By the time he took the title Genghis Khan, he had forged the scattered tribes of the steppe into a single fighting force with a shared identity and purpose. His genius was not merely military, but organizational. He transformed nomadic warfare into something systematic, scalable, and terrifyingly efficient. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, his empire did not fracture, as so many had before it. Instead, it expanded. His successors inherited not just conquered land, but a framework designed for perpetual motion. Armies were divided into units with strict command structures. Communication flowed along relay stations that allowed messages to cross continents in days rather than months. In days rather than months. Intelligence gathering became routine. Before a Mongol army ever appeared on the horizon, scouts had already mapped terrain, counted defenders, and identified weaknesses. What followed was rarely improvisation. It was execution. Conquest under the Mongols followed a brutal logic. Cities were offered a choice: surrender and live, or resist and die. Resistance was punished not simply to win the immediate battle, but to ensure that the next city would not try. News traveled fast, and fear traveled faster. Entire regions collapsed without a fight, their rulers calculating that submission was the only path to survival. Those who resisted became examples. This was not chaos. It was strategy. By the early 13th century, the Mongol war machine had already redrawn the political map of Asia. Northern China suffered decades of devastation. The Khwarezmian Empire, once stretching across much of Central Asia, was annihilated after a single diplomatic insult triggered a campaign of total destruction. Persian cities fell one by one, their populations massacred or displaced. Mongol forces crossed the Caucasus Mountains, defeating armies that had never imagined such speed or coordination possible. These were not reckless advances. Each campaign gathered knowledge, tested enemies, and pushed the limits of Mongol reach further west. Europe remained largely unaware of how close this storm was. Medieval European politics were deeply fragmented. Authority was divided among kings, emperors, popes, bishops, and local lords, all bound together by a feudal system that prized tradition over flexibility. Armies were assembled slowly, dependent on personal obligations rather than centralized command. Warfare followed expected rhythms dictated by seasons and harvests. Knights believed themselves invincible behind steel armor and heavy cavalry charges. Castles were seen as permanent shields against destruction. Few could imagine an enemy that did not fight by familiar rules. The first true warning came through the lands of the Rus, the Eastern Slavic principalities that lay between Europe and the steppe. These territories were wealthy but divided, their rulers locked in constant rivalry. When Mongol forces began probing westward in the 1220s and 1230s, the Rus princes failed to unite, one by one. They faced the invaders alone, and one by one, they fell. Cities that resisted were burned to the ground. Populations were slaughtered or enslaved. Kiev, once a major center of trade and culture, was besieged and destroyed in 1240, its fall echoing across Eastern Europe like a funeral bell. Survivors fled west, bringing stories that sounded exaggerated, even impossible. They spoke of armies that never tired, of enemies who retreated only to return from every direction at once, of commanders who seemed to know their plans before they acted. Many European leaders dismissed these accounts as panic or myth. Others believed the destruction of the Rus was a distant tragedy, unfortunate but irrelevant to their own lands. The steppe, after all, had always been far away. That illusion shattered in 1241. In that year, Mongol armies under the command of Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, crossed into Central Europe. This was not a single invasion force, but a coordinated campaign executed with chilling precision. One army moved into Poland. Another swept through Transylvania, while the main force advanced directly into Hungary. The goal was not simply conquest, but disorientation. By attacking multiple regions at once, the Mongols prevented European powers from uniting or responding effectively. Panic replaced planning. Messages crossed paths. Armies arrived too late or in the wrong place. In Poland, a hastily assembled coalition of local knights, German military orders and regional forces attempted to block the Mongol advance. They believed they faced a detached raiding force, not part of a larger strategic design. When the armies met near Legnica, the Europeans fought with confidence born of tradition. Heavy cavalry charged as it always had, expecting the enemy to break. Instead, they were drawn forward, stretched thin, and enveloped. Mongol horse archers filled the air with arrows, retreating just enough to lure pursuit, then closing the trap from all sides. Smoke obscured the field. Signals were lost. Command collapsed. By the end of the day, the coalition army had ceased to exist. The Duke of Silesia lay dead, his head taken as proof of victory. While news of this disaster spread westward, events in Hungary were unfolding on an even greater scale. King Bela IV had assembled what he believed to be an overwhelming force, drawing nobles and levies from across his kingdom. Hungary's plains seemed ideal for battle, and Bela was determined to stop the invasion before it could advance further. What he did not know was that the Mongols had already studied the terrain, the river crossings, and the layout of his camp. At the Battle of Mohi, they executed a night maneuver that caught the Hungarian army completely off guard. Bridges were seized. Escape routes were cut off. Attacks came from multiple directions at once. Panic spread faster than orders. Tens of thousands were killed as soldiers and camp followers alike fled into marshes and rivers. By morning, the Hungarian army was destroyed. With organized resistance eliminated, the Mongols spread across Hungary. Towns were burned. Crops were destroyed. Fortifications were bypassed or reduced. The population collapsed under the combined weight of violence, starvation, and terror. Refugees streamed westward, carrying stories that grew darker with each retelling. Vienna prepared its defenses. The Holy Roman Empire argued internally while bracing for impact. Across Europe, the realization finally set in that this was not a border war, nor a raid, but an existential threat. By the winter of 1241, nothing stood between the Mongol armies and the heart of Western Europe. They had won every major engagement, their forces were intact, their enemies were broken and divided. To contemporary observers, it seemed inevitable that the invasion would continue when the snow melted. The question was no longer whether Europe could stop the Mongols, but whether there would be anything left to defend when they returned. And yet, even as Europe prepared for annihilation, events far beyond its borders were already shaping a different outcome, one rooted not in European resistance, but in the inner workings of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. As winter tightened its grip on Central Europe, the Mongol armies settled into what appeared, at least to distant observers, to be a pause. Camps were established across the Hungarian plains, horses were rested, and patrols ranged outward, testing borders and probing defenses. To Europeans watching from the west, this pause felt like the calm before execution. Snow and ice had slowed the invaders, but no one believed they had been stopped. When spring came, the roads into Austria and the German lands would lie open, and there would be nothing left to halt the advance. Inside the Mongol camps, however, the atmosphere was not one of triumph alone. The campaign had been devastatingly successful, but it had also stretched the limits of endurance and coordination. Thousands of miles from the Mongol heartland, commanders were operating at the far edge of the empire's logistical reach. Horses required pasture even in winter, and while the Hungarian plains provided grazing, it was never guaranteed. Supply lines were long, and while the Mongols lived lightly, an army of this size could not exist without careful management. Scouts brought back reports not only of enemy movements, but of terrain ahead, forests thickening toward the west, rivers narrowing, and cities whose stone defenses promised prolonged resistance rather than swift destruction. Batu Khan, commander of the Western Campaign, was no ordinary general. As a grandson of Genghis Khan, he carried immense prestige, but prestige within the Mongol world was a fragile thing. Authority flowed from success, lineage, and the favor of the ruling Great Khan. Batu had proven himself in war repeatedly, yet he was not alone in the Mongol elite. Other princes commanded armies elsewhere, each watching, calculating, and remembering. Victory brought glory, but overextension brought vulnerability. Batu understood that conquest was only one part of survival in an empire built on constant competition. Beyond the immediate concerns of the campaign, the Mongol Empire itself was entering a period of tension. Since the death of Genghis Khan, power had been held by his son, Ogedei, elected Great Khan by the Kurultai, the Council of Mongol Leaders. Ogedei had overseen a vast expansion, approving campaigns that stretched from Korea to the edges of Europe. His rule maintained a delicate balance among the descendants of Genghis, each branch of the family holding territories and commands. That balance depended on his authority and on the shared acceptance of tradition. In December 1241, that balance shattered. Ogedei Khan died suddenly, reportedly after a night of heavy drinking, though the precise circumstances mattered less than the consequence. The Great Khan was gone, and with him, the unifying force that held the empire together. According to Mongol custom, a new Great Khan could not simply be declared. A Kurultai had to be convened, and the leading princes of the empire were expected to attend. Absence was not a neutral act. It was a statement, and often a fatal one. The news of Ogedei's death took time to reach the Western Front, traveling across thousands of miles of steppe and mountain. When it did arrive, it transformed the situation overnight. The invasion of Europe, for all its success, suddenly became secondary to a far more dangerous struggle. The question was no longer how far west the Mongols could ride, but who would rule the empire they had already built. For Batu Khan, the implications were immediate. He was powerful, but he was not secure. Other branches of the family, particularly the descendants of Ogedei himself, would push to retain control of the throne. Alliances would form, rivalries would sharpen, and every decision made in the coming months would echo for generations. Remaining in Europe while the future of the empire was decided without him would be reckless. Prestige could evaporate. Command could be reassigned. Even survival was not guaranteed. Yet the decision to withdraw was not made lightly. The Mongols did not abandon campaigns out of fear or weakness. They assessed, calculated, and chose. Europe, despite its riches, was not yet essential to the empire's survival. It lay at the far edge of Mongol reach, distant from the steppe heartlands that defined Mongol identity and power. Conquering it fully would require years of sustained effort, the establishment of administrative structures, and a commitment that could not be reversed easily. At a moment when internal unity was at risk, such a commitment carried enormous danger. There were also deeper strategic questions. The Mongols had mastered warfare on open ground, where speed and maneuver decided battles. Western Europe, however, was a different world. Dense forests limited cavalry movement. Rivers were frequent and heavily fortified. Stone cities required long sieges, tying down forces and eroding the psychological shock that had carried Mongol armies so far. Hungary had been vulnerable, but beyond it lay a landscape less forgiving, less suited to the style of war that had brought such overwhelming success. None of this meant that Europe was safe by virtue of its defenses. It meant only that conquering it would be slower, costlier, and more complex than anything the Mongols had yet attempted. Such an undertaking demanded stability at the center of the empire. Without that stability, even victory could become disaster. As Mongol commanders weighed these realities, Europe waited in terror. Winter deepened suffering across the devastated regions. Famine spread in Hungary as crops lay unharvested and livestock destroyed. Survivors sheltered in forests, ruins, and makeshift camps. Uncertain whether the riders would return with the thaw, monasteries recorded prayers for deliverance. Kings debated fortifications, alliances, and desperate measures, all while lacking reliable information. No one in Europe knew that the fate of their world was being decided not by their own actions, but by politics unfolding far to the east. When the Mongol withdrawal began, it did not announce itself with proclamations or explanations. Patrols simply stopped appearing. Camps were dismantled. Units moved eastward in disciplined columns. There was no panic, no rout, no sign of defeat. To those watching from a distance, it seemed impossible. Armies that had crushed everything before them were leaving without being forced to do so. Some European leaders suspected a trick, believing the retreat was a feigned maneuver designed to lure defenders into the open. Others feared the Mongols were regrouping for a larger assault. Caution prevailed. Fortresses remained sealed. Armies stayed mobilized. Weeks passed, then months. The riders did not return. Slowly, the realization spread that the invasion was over. The psychological impact of this realization was immense. Europe had not been saved by valor or strategy, but by circumstance. There had been no final stand, no decisive victory to celebrate. Instead, there was a lingering unease, a sense that survival had been accidental. Chroniclers struggled to interpret what had happened. Some framed it as divine intervention, arguing that God had spared Christendom at the final moment. Others focused on the horror of what had already occurred, emphasizing repentance and humility rather than triumph. For the Mongols, the retreat marked a turning point as well. Batu Khan returned east, but the unity of the empire he re-entered was already fraying. The succession crisis dragged on for years as regents ruled in the absence of a new great Khan. Factions maneuvered, alliances shifted, and the sense of unstoppable expansion began to fade. The empire remained vast, but its direction was no longer singular. Batu himself would never fully reconcile with the descendants of Ögedei. The rivalries that emerged during the succession struggle hardened into lasting divisions, shaping the political geography of the Mongol world. The western territories would evolve into what became known as the Golden Horde, a powerful state in its own right, oriented more toward the steppe and the lands of the Rus than toward Western Europe. The moment for further advance westward passed, not because it was impossible, but because it was no longer central to Mongol priorities. In Europe, recovery was slow and painful. Hungary, in particular, had been shattered. Entire regions lay empty, their populations killed or displaced. King Bela IV undertook massive rebuilding efforts, encouraging settlement, constructing stone, fortifications, and reorganizing defenses. The memory of the invasion shaped policy for generations. Castles became stronger, cities fortified more aggressively. The assumption that traditional warfare would always suffice had been violently disproven. Diplomatically, Europe began to look east with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Envoys were sent to the Mongol court not to challenge, but to understand. Reports returned describing a sophisticated empire, governed by laws, administration, and a vision of order that defied European stereotypes of barbarism. Trade routes reopened and expanded, linking Europe more directly to Asia than ever before. The world, once distant and abstract, felt suddenly connected. Yet beneath these changes lingered an uncomfortable truth. Europe had not defeated the Mongols. It had been spared by events beyond its control. The invasion could, in theory, resume. That knowledge shaped European thinking long after the immediate danger had passed. Preparedness replaced complacency. Memory replaced myth. For centuries, historians would debate why the Mongols left. Climate, logistics, terrain, internal politics, tradition, and chance all played their roles. No single explanation fully captures the decision because the decision itself emerged from a convergence of factors, each reinforcing the other. What is clear is that history pivoted on that moment. Had Ogedei lived longer, had succession be smoother, had priorities aligned differently, the story of Europe might have ended very differently. Mongol armies vanished from Europe as abruptly as they had appeared, leaving behind ruins, unanswered questions, and a deep awareness of vulnerability. The riders returned east, drawn back into the gravitational pull of empire, politics, and legacy. Europe, shaken but alive, began the long process of rebuilding, unaware of just how narrowly it had escaped. A future that would have erased the world it knew. In the years that followed the Mongol withdrawal, Europe struggled to understand what had happened to it. The destruction left behind was undeniable, but the absence of a final battle or clear victory made the experience difficult to process. Survivors rebuilt cities without knowing whether the riders would one day return. Rulers fortified borders while quietly acknowledging that fortifications alone had not saved them. Chroniclers searched scripture and prophecy for explanations, framing the invasion as punishment narrowly averted, rather than a war survived. The psychological scar ran deeper than any ruined wall. Europe had seen its future and understood, perhaps for the first time, how fragile its world truly was. Hungary bore the deepest wounds. Entire regions remained empty years after the invasion, their populations killed or scattered. King Bela IV ruled over a kingdom that had nearly ceased to exist, and he understood that returning to old assumptions would mean extinction if the Mongols ever came again. He transformed Hungary's defenses, encouraging the construction of stone castles instead of wooden fortifications, reshaping settlement patterns, and centralizing authority in ways that would have been politically unthinkable before the invasion. Survival had rewritten the rules. What once seemed excessive or tyrannical now appeared necessary. Elsewhere in Europe, similar changes took root. Rulers began to value intelligence, speed, and coordination over sheer numbers or tradition. The myth of invincible heavy cavalry had been shattered on the fields of Lagnica and Mohi. Armies adapted slowly, but the memory of helplessness lingered, influencing military thought for generations. Even the church, long accustomed to interpreting history through a theological lens, began to recognize the importance of gathering information about the wider world. Ignorance had nearly been fatal. At the same time, Europe's perception of the Mongols began to evolve. The initial terror did not fade, but it was joined by curiosity and calculation. Envoys were sent east, sometimes as missionaries, sometimes as diplomats, sometimes as spies. What they encountered challenged European assumptions. The Mongol Empire was not chaos on horseback. It was governed by law, administration, and a vision of order that prioritized stability and tribute over endless destruction. Cities that submitted lived. Trade flourished under Mongol protection. Roads were secured. Merchants traveled distances once thought impossible. This contact reshaped the medieval world. Knowledge moved alongside goods. Technologies, ideas, and even diseases crossed continents with unprecedented speed. Europe, long inward-looking and fragmented, found itself drawn into a global system it had never anticipated. The near destruction of 1241 to 1242 became, paradoxically, one of the forces that pushed Europe outward, toward engagement rather than isolation. Meanwhile, the Mongol world itself was changing. The death of Ogedai had not merely paused expansion, it had exposed the limits of unity. The long delay before a new great Khan was elected weakened central authority, and rival branches of Genghis Khan's family grew increasingly autonomous. Batu Khan established his power base in the western steppes, ruling over the lands of the Rus, and forming what would become known as the Golden Horde. His interests lay north and east, focused on tribute, trade, and dominance over familiar terrain rather than renewed campaigns into Western Europe. Other parts of the empire followed similar paths. The vast Mongol realm fractured into successor states, each retaining elements of Mongol law and culture, but pursuing its own priorities. Expansion slowed not because the Mongols had lost their ability to conquer, but because conquest was no longer the singular goal that bound them together. Administration, taxation, and internal stability took precedence. The empire that had once seemed unstoppable became a network of powerful competing powers. This fragmentation helps explain why the invasion of Europe was never resumed on the same scale. The conditions that had made it possible were gone. Unity had weakened, ambition had diversified. Europe, while still vulnerable, was no longer the obvious target it had once been. The moment had passed. Historians have long debated whether Europe could have survived a full Mongol conquest had that moment not passed. Some argue that Western Europe's terrain and fortifications would eventually have slowed the invaders, forcing adaptation on both sides. Others point to the Mongols' demonstrated ability to adapt elsewhere, suggesting that resistance would have been overcome given time. What remains uncontested is how close Europe came to finding out the answer the hard way. The withdrawal of 1242 was not a victory earned, but a reprieve granted by circumstance. It hinged on a death thousands of miles away, on traditions older than any European kingdom, on political calculations made in distant camps where Europe itself was little more than a frontier. No hero rode in at the last moment. No alliance saved the day. History turned quietly, without ceremony, and the world continued on. A path that had nearly ended. This is what makes the event so unsettling. It challenges the comforting narratives people prefer, the idea that survival is always the result of courage or righteousness. Sometimes, survival is accidental. Sometimes it is decided elsewhere by forces indifferent to those whose lives hang in the balance. The Mongols did not retreat because Europe defeated them. They retreated because empire demanded their attention more urgently than conquest. And yet, that near miss mattered. It reshaped Europe's political development, military thinking, and relationship with the wider world. It left behind a collective memory of vulnerability that influenced decisions for centuries. It serves as a reminder that history is not a straight line, but a series of intersections where chance, choice, and structure collide. When the Mongol riders vanished from Europe, they left behind more than ruins. They left behind a question that still echoes through the story. What if they had continued? What kind of world will have emerged from the ashes of medieval Europe? What ideas, cultures, and institutions would never have existed? We can never know the answers, only that they were frighteningly close to becoming reality. History often remembers battles and victories, but it is shaped just as profoundly by moments when something almost happened. In the winter of 1242, the greatest invasion force the world had ever known stood on the edge of Europe's future, and then turned away. The silence that followed was not peace, but possibility, a future preserved not by triumph, but by a decision made far beyond the horizon. If you want to explore more moments like this, moments where history balanced on a knife's edge, where entire civilizations were shaped by decisions made in distant places, make sure to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments what you think would have happened if the Mongols had not turned back? Would Europe have adapted? Or would the world we know today have vanished before it ever truly began?